Adult Protective Services can be a tremendous asset for prosecutors. They'll be able to help prosecutors with the services that are available in the community. And more importantly, they've probably spent many hours already with the victim, with the defendant, with family members. They're going to be able to tell prosecutors more about the case. They may also have information in their case records that the prosecutors don't know about. In some states, Adult Protective Service programs are able to do administrative subpoenas. So they may have bank records, medical records, or other records that might be very, very helpful. Also, in some states, Adult Protective Services may have done a forensic accounting or worked with a CPA, so there may be some documentations that the prosecutors aren't aware of. It's a great partnership when APS and prosecutors get together.
How about your experience in building relationships with different government agencies, different service providers? Could you talk to us a little bit about your experience in that and how that's been important in working to address elder abuse?
The only thing that I've ever seen that worked is person. So I would suggest starting with an individual, talking to them about the special needs of older victims, even persons with disabilities, and start to build that relationship one-on-one. The other thing I would say is to become an invaluable resource. The first thing you don't want to do to ask of anyone is to ask something of them. The best way to build a relationship is to provide yourself as someone who can be helpful. The best way that I've seen is cross-training. Everyone needs to fulfill hours of training, every profession, even prosecutors and different attorneys. And coming in and providing some cross-training on what is elder abuse, what to look for, what are the certain things that they should be aware of, what Adult Protective Services can do. So that's the type. You start with individual relationships, and through that, you become more of an asset or a resource for someone. Then that opens the door for older victims and more of a dialogue and working relationship.
When you think about the mission of an Adult Protective Services agency, how can an agency like that help a prosecutor hold perpetrators of elder abuse accountable?
Adult Protective Services may be looking at gathering facts to do substantiation, where prosecution is looking at what's the evidence-based prosecution that I can do. And that's where working together, if we work together in the beginning and know what is needed on the back end, meaning holding perpetrators accountable, then Adult Protective Services could be a lot more effective partner in helping get that information and move it forward. When we did that initial home visit, have we done it together with law enforcement? Did we let the local prosecutor know that we think a crime may have been committed? Did we partner well there? And as we started to gather information, how did we document it?
Can you share your investigative product, the work that you've been doing, your case file, with a law enforcement investigator or a victim advocate?
I can in the state of Maine, and once again I check with the different statutes. Often written into the APS Acts are that you can share with law enforcement, which also includes prosecutors as well. So whatever I have, the prosecutor can get.
And so victims that may have difficulty communicating or maybe are reluctant to communicate, is it ever possible to do joint interviews with law enforcement?
It's preferable. The question that we should ask ourselves in Adult Protective Services is, do we think a crime has been committed? If the answer is yes at intake, then the first phone call ought to be to our prosecutor, if that's the protocol, or at least to law enforcement. Because if a crime's been committed, I need to be thinking about a couple of things. Victim safety first, but evidence to help and hold the person accountable. So joint visits, if you have that relationship, it also is in the best interest of the victim. Don't make me tell my story 15 times. I'm going to get tired of telling the story and I will stop talking. It's not because I'm older, it's because we're all normal. We all do it at any age. Try to have the victim tell the story as few times as they have to and have as many professionals available to help. Some of the best interviews that I have ever done has become because law enforcement has been with me. Not because I thought of the questions or the cadence or the ways to ask the questions, it's because they did. We have a lot to learn, and law enforcement and prosecutors can help us in that area in ways that we might not even imagine until we do that joint visit, until we do that joint interview.
We absolutely encourage joint visits. Anything that can help move the interview along. There are times where we can't get into a client's home because the abuser is there, and the abuser is impeding our ability to interview. So we will call the police. We will have police escorts We will go out with police. We go in New York City, we'll go out with the domestic violence officers. In other jurisdictions, I know that there are partnerships with law enforcement where joint visits are made. Some jurisdictions call them wellness visits, where they help us interview the person that's allegedly being abused.
Is there any other sort of advice that you would like to give to prosecutors who handle elder abuse cases?
When it works well, the relationship, a working relationship between law enforcement, prosecutors, and APS is a fine-oiled machine. And older victims get served in a way that none of us can imagine. When it doesn't work, and when we point fingers and blame ourselves, the only one that suffers is the victim. The person who benefits is always the person who is the perpetrator of this and not held accountable.
I was taught by a prosecutor, Arlene Markarian, that it's not Adult Protective Services' job to prove the case. If we have a suspicion, it's our job to refer it to local law enforcement. And that's what should be done. When we've gone out there and conducted an interview and determined that we believe the person is a victim of abuse, it is our job then to include law enforcement so that they can do their part. But we can work collaboratively so that we can safeguard this at-risk person.
Can you give an example of where that collaboration might take place?
When we've gone out to visit a person and we find that the person may have missing money, their bank accounts have withdrawals, and we cannot identify who's withdrawing the money, but we suspect because there's a person with power of attorney. We would then refer that case, and whatever documentation that we have that gives us reason to believe that there's exploitation going on, we would forward that information to local law enforcement. I don't think that you can investigate elder abuse without having a relationship with prosecutors. There must be a relationship. There must be a working relationship where you can go back and forth, you can ask questions. There are times where I will call a prosecutor just to ask a question, not to report a case, but to ask a question. There are times where I will float a case by a prosecutor, and vice versa. A prosecutor will call me and say, what do you think about this case? Is this an appropriate referral for APS? Is this an appropriate case where APS can intervene?